Right, in today's video we're just going to talk about service schedules. Now we've covered most of the servicing, change oil, change sprockets and all that sort of stuff, the actual mechanics of doing the servicing, but it come up recently as a good question is when should I do the servicing? Just to be very clear what I'm covering in this video, we're talking about your standard scheduled maintenance items. That's like your oil, tappets, spark plug. I'm not talking about inspection items which need to be inspected regularly and changed as they're worn. Stuff like your battery, your tyres, clutch adjustments, brake pads. That's a separate thing. Okay, this is just the scheduled maintenance items. Stuff like tyres, chain and sprockets. These items don't really have a schedule. You basically just need to inspect them on a regular basis and then change them when they're worn out. Okay, but as far as other things go, like engine oil, valve adjustment, brake fluid, stuff like that, they have a service schedule. Now if we look at the service schedule in the manual, it's a complete load of garbage. It's just rubbish, so it's not really any use, really, and I wouldn't follow what it says. It actually doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, to be honest. So I tend to base my service schedule on my other bikes. I base it on the other bikes I own. I've also owned quite a lot of 70s and 80s single cylinder small capacity bikes, which the ZSB basically is a little bit modernised with fuel injection and better brakes, but it's essentially an air-cooled 2-valve single cylinder. I'm starting to waffle on a bit, but anyway, and it's basically an 80s bike, so I've owned plenty of them with service schedule, and bikes like the GS125 or the CB125S or something like that are pretty much all a very similar design and stuff, so I base my servicing on that. Okay, so if you look in the service schedule for changing the oil, now I've talked about changing the oil before in the past, but this is my take on it, and you might have completely different thoughts on it, and your bike might be used differently. Both these ZSBs were being used for commuting, and commuting either a short distance or a moderate distance, and that was all weathers as well. Basically the kids were using them for college and work, so they were out in very horrible weather and stuff like that, and with it being an air-cooled engine, it's just prone to getting a bit of water in the oil, so changing oil very frequently is a good idea. Now it's a good idea for any bike, but for the ZSB it's a very good idea. First of all, it holds a tiny amount of oil. It holds just on a litre of oil, so that oil is working pretty hard. If you look at the guzzi here, the design of this engine, this has got a separate gearbox and a separate clutch, so the oil doesn't have to do any of that work. It's only using the engine. I've got a very low tuned large capacity engine, and this engine's holding 3.5 litres of oil, so that oil not only is it probably working harder in the ZSB because it's producing more power per capacity, it's also got a third of the capacity, or even less than a third of the capacity, so that oil's got to work 3 times as hard. So in my book, to save that, we're just going to change the oil 3 times as frequently, and that will put us on an even keel. So what I tend to do with it is the maximum I'm ever going to leave the oil in the perfect conditions, and the oil's in good condition. The bike's been used over long distances, it hasn't had many cold starts on it, I'm going to leave it 1,000 miles, but I would reduce that down to 500 miles in the winter when it's doing lots of cold starts. There's a little bit of water in the oil and that thing. Another thing to consider actually with the ZSB is there's very little in the way of oil filtration. It's got a centrifugal filter, but that really can't be serviced easily, so changing oil is a good way of getting the debris out of the oil. Okay, don't bother with the strainer on the side. Let's have a quick look at the oil strainer here. I really would only touch the oil strainer. I don't know if you can make that out. The oil strainer, the gauze filter and the oil strainer, I would only change that maybe every 4 or 5 changes. It's worth opening it just to see what's in there, but once it's clear, you should just stay clear. If you do find stuff in there, then it's pretty bad really, so if you got to that point, you're probably screwed up anyway. Okay, brake fluid. With the later bikes, the fuel injection and the link brakes, I find regular maintenance is essential on the link brakes. Now you want to be putting some fluid through the link brakes, and it says in the manual every 2 years. I would tend to do it every year. Now I tend to do all my bikes every year, and some of my bikes go on the track, and of course a lot of them are doing 2 at work, and of course these are kids' bikes as well, so I'm always on top of maintenance. I tend to put some fluid through once a year. Now putting fluid through once a year is a really good idea because you're not getting into any trouble. It's very easy to put fluid through the bike when there's no air in the system. If you let the brakes get bad and you've got to take a caliper off or something and you get air into the system, then it just becomes a lot more of a difficult job. So I think from my point of view here, just regular maintenance, keep changing the fluid, pump a load of fluid through it once a year, take the caps off, put fluid on, pump it through, open the bleed nipples, just pump a load of fluid through, and I mean like a third of a can, something like that, a third to half a can, put plenty through it, change all the fluid in there. Not only is that staying on top of it, it's going to get all that water out of the brake fluid, and that water is not going to help your caliper pistons from rotting and everything else from rotting. So regular maintenance once a year, that's my take on it. If you want to do every other year, you can sort of do that, but once a year, you know what, it's not a big job, but it will be a big job if you neglect it. Valve adjustment. So here's another bone of contention. So the sizes that are listed in the manual, now I've not looked in the manual for a little bit actually, to be honest. Definitely in the first manual seemed to be out by a factor of 10. 0.01 clearance seemed to be absolutely ridiculous and not even measurable really. So what I tend to do is I do standard sort of fittings. I've got plenty of push-up bikes, and as I say, I've owned loads of these bikes, so I think I've always set all my bikes to 0.1 inlet, 0.15 exhaust. Now I'm checking them, I know the engine's in good condition, I'm changing oil frequently, I'm listening to them. If they go quiet or if they go really loud, then I know it's time to do valves. But to be honest, they don't really move much. I think this bike's done about 6,000 miles since we've had it, and I think I might have adjusted just the exhaust a bit, and it was only marginal. So I would be looking to do the valves about every 6,000 miles, I think. Every 6,000, you know, it's a nice job you can just do on a wet summer's day, something when it's raining or something, you're not out riding. It's a bit of a pain, the tank and everything needs to come off, and that little engine bracket on the back needs to come off to do it easily, and it's not that easy a job actually, to be honest, because it's sort of in line with the frame. Anyway, I'm waffling. About every 6,000 miles. ZSB's needs a tyre, so we'll take the tyre off, and this gives us a good chance to talk about tyres, when we should replace tyres, when should we replace chain and sprockets. Okay, so tyres, so the law states it's got to be 1 millimetre tread over 3/4 of the tyre, and the rest of the tyre needs to be visible tread. So this tyre is down to 1 millimetre, and I think that's sort of the time to replace, especially if you're riding in all weathers. I think 1 millimetre just on the central bit of the tyre here, and you can buy a very cheap sort of tyre gauge. I might have one about, have I got one lying around? Can't see one. 1 millimetre I think's the thing. A lot of tyres have little bars in here. When that bar's level with the outside of it, that's normally 1 millimetre. Or it's definitely time to change. That's what the manufacturer's saying, you change it, so you definitely don't want to go below the bar. If you're riding in all weathers and it's convenient, I'd get that tyre changed as soon as you can. Choice of tyres, you know, everyone knows hate the Chinese tyres, rubbish Chinese tyres. Almost any tyre is going to be better than the Chinese tyre. This is an Anlas. These are sort of tier 2 or tier 3 sort of tyre. I do like the tier 1s. I always think it's best to buy the best tyre you can afford. You know, broken collarbones, broken ankles, and a bent bike to save yourself a tenner isn't really worth it. In fact, they're not even a tenner for the best tyre. You know, I think we've just fitted a Michelin City Extra. That's probably the best tyre you can get. Actually, look at the tread on that. It looks like a bloody off-road tyre. That much tread on it. I think this was 48. I think the standard City is 45, 46. And these are really good tyres, the Michelins, and I'd always recommend the Michelins on the little bikes. I think the French take their little bikes seriously, and Michelin are one of the few companies that makes really good tyres for little bikes, so always happy with Michelins on little bikes. Right, change sprockets. Right, so change sprockets. A visual inspection. So a visual inspection of the sprocket, and you can see the way this teeth's nice and even. You see worn sprockets, they go completely out of shape here. Okay, so a good way to check that your chain sprocket is good. I don't really want to get my hands too dirty here, but if you push the chain up in the middle of the bottom run just to take the slack out of it, and then with your fingers on the back of the sprocket here, I don't know if you can quite see that. There, I'm going to pull the chain back, and if you can pull that chain back enough to expose at least half the tooth of the sprocket, or even all the tooth of the sprocket, then you know that chain's worn out. Again, advice on chain replacement: always go for the best quality you can afford. Don't go for a DID chain. Don't buy a cheap one off eBay, like a gold one, whatever that they are on eBay. Forget that. You just want to go to Lexmoto, buy a DID chain. I think they do a standard kit's about 35, and the heavy duty kit's about 40 quid. The heavy duty kit is just great, or the standard kit. It's all good quality kit, so I would definitely just do that. Spark plug. Okay, so I've never really found that with modern plugs they really need to be changed as often as they say. The plug's got to come out anyway through the tappet, so you're doing that every 6,000 miles, so maybe every other tappet swap the spark plug over. The carburetor bikes might be a little bit harder on plugs than the fuel injection one, but modern fuel injection bikes with modern spark plugs, this just seems to last forever, to be honest. But I would check it every 12,000, maybe change it every 12,000 just for safety. Whatever. A good quality NGK plug, whatever the equivalent is. The name escapes me at the moment. But anyway, 12,000 miles. Right, air filter behind the side cover here. Again, I think the manual says every 3,000 miles. I think that's a bit too much, really. Especially in this country, it's not very dusty. I would just, every time we do the tappets at 6,000 miles, I would just give it a rinse out. But if it looks really dirty, then maybe you need to move that up a bit. But you know, rule of thumb, I would go clean the air filter out, re-oil it, put it all back together every 6,000. When you do the tappets, I think it's a good time to do it. Right then, to summarise,